Morning, everybody. I'm Jamil Jaffer. I'm the director of the Knight Institute. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to the National Press Club, and not only to the National Press Club, but to the First Amendment Lounge, which is obviously where we should be. We're going to be talking this morning about whether middleware can save social media. And I think that turns out to be an especially well-timed conversation since the verdicts in the Meta and the YouTube cases earlier this week have spurred many of us to consider, once again, what social media needs to be saved from, who should be doing the saving, and whether it can be saved without shredding the First Amendment. Our speakers today have spent many years thinking about these questions, and I know all of us are really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. There are some more specific questions that I'm hoping we'll address over the course of this morning too. I'll identify three of them. So first, middleware may offer a way of addressing some of social media's pathologies in a way that respects the First Amendment. But which pathologies exactly? Second, what can legislators, regulators, and the rest of us do to promote the development of the kind of middleware that we have in mind? And third, if middleware's potential has its limits, as it surely does, what else needs to be part of our policy agenda? Or to put this question another way, what's the larger policy agenda of which the promotion of middleware should be one part? This event is one part of the Knight Institute's collaboration with Olivier Sylvain, who has been a senior fellow with the Institute over the past 18 or so months. For all of us at the Knight Institute, it has really been a great privilege to work with Olivier and to learn from him, including on this project about middleware. As some of you know, Olivier has a new book. It's called Reclaiming the Internet: How Big Tech Took Control and How We Can Take It Back. It is really good. I highly recommend that you all read it. On behalf of the Knight Institute, I want to thank all of the speakers for their participation today, especially those who traveled long distances and dealt with ridiculous lines and unpredictable ICE agents at the airports. I also want to thank a few people from the Knight Institute who helped put this event together: Ashna Agarwal, Dustin Foote, Shira Minsk, Ryan Morgan, Gabriel Tyler, and Candace White. Finally, I want to thank our policy director, Nadine Furry-Johnson, who developed the idea for this event with Olivier and oversaw all of the planning. Now I'm going to turn things over to Nadine to welcome the first panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamil. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you're here today. As you've seen from the agenda, we will have two panels that are sandwiching a lively, hopefully, keynote discussion. So I'm going to ask our first panel to come up and talk with us about what exactly are we talking about when we talk about middleware.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today with two phenomenal experts on middleware. So as Nadine mentioned, the purpose of this panel is really to set the table for today's conversations, to begin to discuss how it is that middleware can help improve the digital public sphere, the limitations of middleware, and the barriers that exist to its development. So with me are Daphne Keller, who is the Director of Platform Regulation at the Stanford Program in Law, Science, and Technology. Her work focuses on platform regulation and internet users' rights. She was previously Associate General Counsel at Google. And next we have Richard Reisman, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Foundation for American Innovation. He is also an independent media tech innovator and a frequent contributor to Tech Policy Press, where he has written extensively about middleware. I should mention that we will have some time at the very end for a brief Q&A, so if you have any questions, you can submit them in person or online, and I will try to get to them in the time that we have. So I thought we could start by just grounding this conversation. The debate about middleware can often seem abstract, especially to those without a technical background. So I'm wondering if you could each start by giving us a concrete example of a middleware product or proposal that helps illustrate the promise or limits of the concept.
Should I go? Sure. Okay, so I will start with a simple one from the real world. There used to be a company called Power Ventures, and what they offered to users was a way of pulling all their social media feeds from different sources together in a single user interface, and kind of like interleaving the posts all in one feed, and they could push their own posts out to multiple social networks. That's a super simple example of middleware, but you can also imagine that same tool imposing a new ranking algorithm or blocking certain kinds of content and playing a content moderation role. And I like this example because it illustrates kind of two sets of issues. The first is legal. So Facebook sued Power Ventures out of existence. They did so using the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is a pretty antiquated anti-hacking law that is also a problem for journalism, transparency, a number of other very promising goals, and which could be fixed. So there's a legal problem, a legal barrier that could be addressed. And then the second thing that's interesting that it illustrates is I actually don't know if it was taking all your social media feeds and sending them to Power Ventures servers, or if everything happened right there on the user's device. And that's an important difference because if it's happening on the user's device, then the user can be seeing Facebook posts from their friends that aren't public, and only the user ever sees them, and any re-ranking from the software happens right there on the device. Versus if all of that went to Power Ventures, then there's a third party suddenly seeing, your cousin's breastfeeding photographs or whatever privately shared content is there. So there's this privacy question with middleware for products like Facebook with private sharing, but there are also potential solutions depending on the technical design.
So, yeah, that's a good example of sort of the classic sense of what middleware is. What I think I'd like to emphasize is where middleware is probably going, and the question is where it should be going, which sort of gets back to Jamil's questions of what are we trying to protect from and by who. To me, the more interesting flavors of middleware is what's emerging in environments like Blue Sky, and I'll get into a little more about that. There's two diagrams. If you go to Bitly and R. Reisman, you'll see the two diagrams because we're not, but we'll get into that. Basically, Blue Sky is a greenfield development of a new social media platform based on protocols. And middleware, there's sort of two ways you can come at middleware. There's Fukuyama's group, which is unbundling it from the big platforms and taking out control of certain things like attention and your feeds. But the other approach is a protocol-based approach that Mike Masnick has been championing for quite a while, and which is what Blue Sky is based on, so that it's intrinsically designed to provide for middleware. And the core focus has been on attention and composing feeds, so that you have algorithmic choice, they call it. I think they have tens of thousands of feeds that people choose from. There's companies building tools to help users and communities build feeds. I think we'll get into more of that in the next question. But there's a bunch of groups trying to build a whole ecosystem around middleware to just change the way social media works, to make it work more like the way media worked in democracy before tech took over and crowded out journalism and communities and institutions from the flow of information.
So as Jamil mentioned right up front, middleware is often seen as a way to address the pathologies of social media without trenching on First Amendment rights, which is something that other regulatory interventions are often accused of doing. So is that a fair framing? And if so, how does middleware thread that needle? How does it help us promote public discourse, a better digital public sphere, while avoiding the First Amendment pitfalls of other reforms?
So middleware avoids a big set of First Amendment problems. It doesn't avoid all of them. I'll talk about the big set first, which is about the rights of internet users, the First Amendment rights to read what they want to read and share what they want to share. So I've been at Stanford for 10 years, and probably the single most fun thing I did in that period was to write an amicus brief with Yale law professor Jack Balkin on behalf of Francis Fukuyama to file in the Moody case, the case about the Texas and Florida must-carry laws. And what we said in that brief was, let's assume that these states' goals are legitimate. You know, they said our problem is with the concentration of power in the hands of these big platform corporations, and we want to disrupt that power. Great, let's accept that's a legitimate goal to diversify the voices on the internet. But then their next step was, and we as the government are going to come in and tell platforms what their speech rules should be instead. And that's the part we didn't like. So if you don't want that corporate concentration of power, and you also don't want the government to come in and set the rules, what is the best remaining option? I think it is to devolve the power to individuals to have control over their media environment and to make choices. And this is something that the Supreme Court has said repeatedly, including in the Playboy case, which speaks eloquently to the idea that giving control to individual speakers and listeners is the best and most First Amendment compliant solution. So middleware means users can say what they want. They can get the speech environment rules that they want, and, you know, unless what they want is actually illegal content. But the platform is not prevented from offering its own newsfeed with its own content moderation and its own ranking. So it's not stopping the platform from sharing its speech. So far, so good. But then I think if there was like a mandate, an interoperability mandate, probably platforms would still bring a First Amendment objection saying, you're forcing us to, you know, carry these ranking algorithms that we don't want to, or process information about them, or post directions to users about how to install them. So there is this real, but much smaller remaining First Amendment question.
So, yeah, that's sort of the core, and that's been sort of the traditional focus. And I think that's definitely the place to start. What I'm suggesting is to sort of broaden the picture, because it eliminates the role. And so that first diagram that I talk about in some of my work is basically, we've been focused on expression as coming out of thought. What, is it on?
For the remote people.
Yeah. So the idea is, you know, we've got all these debates over free speech, but it's for me and not for thee. And there's, you know, when the power changes, the people who had power over what got moderated out are saying it gets turned around, and there's big fights over who moderates what. And the problem is that you're looking at only part of the picture, because thought is a cycle. In social media, it goes, you get likes, shares, and comments and all of that, which affect how the algorithm works. And then it comes back into your feed, and that affects your further thought. And it's the feeds that really matter, which has to do with what Daphne just said about listener rights. As a listener, I need to control my attention. And the reason the platforms have done this is because there's just, you know, too much in the fire hose of stuff. They have to filter it so that you just see part of it. But what they filter is, you should be deciding how to filter your feed. So it's attention that's the real issue, not expression. And once you change the focus, then the battles over expression get to be secondary, and it's a question of who controls the attention. So that sort of gets to the second part of how I think we need to broaden it, the focus has been on attention and user control of their attention, but it's sort of ignoring the fact that the platforms have disintermediated communities, institutions, journalism. You used to, bowling alone got to the thing where people used to informally communicate. There's sort of, the press is struggling to get links now that the people have changed search algorithms because they don't have any more direct channel and they've been crowded out. So the three pillars that I've been proposing, one is attention, which is the user agency. The other major filter is what I've been calling the social mediation ecosystem, which is all of this amorphous mix, polycentric communities, institutions that have helped us make sense of what we're hearing and guide our attention. The third pillar is basically reputation, which is sort of distilled from the social mediation process, and where we build a sense of who makes sense, who doesn't, and that's very topic dependent. There may be people we agree with in a certain domain and think are totally off the wall in other domains. So you can build reputation systems to help guide the whatever algorithms are channeling attention, whether it's by the platforms or by middleware. Middleware really is a technical enabling facility. So it's used loosely to talk about these services that are built on top of the middleware enablement, attention management, the community services, and protection of your data. But middleware itself is simply the technology for interoperation that lets independent sources of service or just software work with the communication platform. So the basic pillar structure I have is your underlying network, then there's a layer of middleware that lets everything interconnect, and then your three pillars are interconnecting, and that produces what comes out as the discourse in the public square, the public sphere, which is not unitary, but is really a whole bunch of different spheres. And we're seeing movement toward that. Some of the examples, well, Blue Sky is doing it a lot, and there's a bunch of groups that are developing communities. There's the Free Our Feeds, there's the Social Web Foundation, there's Project Liberty, and then there's now a thing in terms of national efforts like Eurosky, which is trying to take control from the US platforms and move it into things that are more focused on European users' needs. And so they're all using this AT protocol, which, so you think of Blue Sky as just one little piece of it, but you can build independent Blue Sky-like services that all interconnect. And so you own your identity, you own your data, and you own your social graph, and you can use Blue Sky, the original Blue Sky. You can use Black Sky, which is for the Black community, which is sort of the reincarnation of Black Twitter, but in this middleware-based structure. And it doesn't depend on the whims of whether Twitter cuts off APIs or Facebook allows you to do these things. So like Block Party did it with Twitter, but got cut off. Blue Sky just enables you to do things like that, and nobody can cut it off.
Which is one of the more exciting features of Blue Sky. Middleware also has its skeptics who often argue that middleware is, at best a half measure because it doesn't address the underlying systemic problems of ad-based business models, engagement optimization, data accumulation that produce the pathologies that we have in mind in the first place. And I'm wondering how you would both respond to that structural critique of middleware.
So I'll start by hearkening back to what Jamil asked at the beginning about what problems we're trying to solve. Almost every kind of terrible human behavior has an online analog. And for almost any of them, we could ask if there's a way you can regulate the platforms as intermediaries to try to solve the new internet version of that problem. But this is stuff that had thousands of laws governing it back in the offline world. And the fact that the idea that a single change is going to redress all of those things is just, not an illusion that we should hold on to. The lawmaking here needs to be iterative. But for the question of the sort of the pathologies, I do want to back away from that terminology a little bit, because often what we're talking about is platforms giving users the speech they seem to want, and it is perfectly legal speech. So, I could see something I might call pathological there, but that doesn't make it something that the government can necessarily step in and regulate. And I say this as someone who's, I'm down with some paternalism. I'm down with some eat your vegetables, let me put some news in your news feed. But that gets political very quickly. We have a very political FTC and FCC right now stepping in and imposing their preferences for what content people should see. If we have a regulatory structure that says the government can stop you from seeing information that's bad for you, well, under one government, that might mean you don't see LGBTQ plus content. You don't see reproductive rights information. Under another, it might mean you don't see gun content, you don't see religious content. So moving this into the state regulatory mode worries me. And this is where, again, like middleware, not only, lets a user step in and say, yeah, my behavior might be indicating that this is what I want because I'm clicking with my lizard brain, but let me sit down and make a more deliberate choice. Here's what I actually want to see. Here are some settings that I want to set, and sort of interpose their own considered preferences. And as a technical matter, Jonathan Stray at UC Berkeley has done a lot of interesting writing and continues to do work on that set of models and questions.
Yeah, so that's sort of the underlying issue, that there's all kinds of things that we need to do. And I guess the core is that, especially if you look at middleware in the sense that I'm saying, it's the enabling technology that lets you do all these different things. It's not saying that you have to it's not a single cure, it's not a solution in itself. It's enabling all these other measures. So you can, whatever our legal approaches to regulation are still allowable. All of the pro-social things that people would like to do can be done in a middleware framework. And it actually facilitates it, because now the platforms aren't the gatekeepers over what you can do that's pro-social. So you can build this social mediation ecosystem, you can build in deliberation, you can build in bridging systems, you can change dark patterns, the design questions that have come up, to the extent that you can regulate design issues. That can be done in a middleware context. There's also business model issues. One of the key things is the business model. So there's no reason that you can't reform the business model by putting taxes on ads, by limiting the ability to use ads, which is what drives engagement, which is what produces a lot of the harms of social media when they're being addictive. So one of the approaches, aside from just a flat tax, you could have a ratchet thing, which works the way auto emissions work, that you start out with a relatively liberal base, that 5% of your revenue has to start coming from sources other than ads, and then you gradually ratchet to where it's 10%, 20%, 50%, and you just make ads be a smaller piece of it. And also advertising, as you get user choice enabled by middleware, you can give users control over how advertising works. There's the idea of a reverse meter, where you get credit for your attention and your data in return for watching ads. And so you now have a negotiation on a more level playing field, where the user determines to what, and this is happening to some degree already, where you pay for ad-free streaming, or you get it free and you watch ads. So you build on that principle to where the users can negotiate what kind of ads they're willing to see, on what subjects, how intrusive, and how much credit they get, and that could offset subscription fees. I think there's an argument that says social media should not be generally free. It should be more like a freemium model, where you get basic services free, but advanced services you pay for. And another factor that sort of relates to this is looking forward. there's a fusion between AI and social media. And much the same problems are starting to develop in AI in terms of advertising and bias and things like that. And the fusion is that AI is being used in social media to control feeds and other algorithms, and social media content is now being used to create AI, so that Reddit is now a major part of the corpus that AI is drawing from, and that's user-generated content that's not reliable. It doesn't have a reputation or any real provenance. But if you use middleware to allow the market to create these kinds of infrastructures that are similar to what we've had in traditional society, of things that like Consumer Reports and NewsGuard and services, and if you don't like NewsGuard, you've come up with other services that have different styles, and you let the market determine in a democratic way which of these tools apply. So all of these things, there's nothing to stop anything from being done just because it's middleware.
So one could say that Congress has tried once before to foster the creation of middleware through Section 230. Section 230 is, of course, best known for its creation of liability shields that mean that the platforms aren't liable for the content that users post on them, while allowing them to moderate that content. But there is a much less discussed provision of 230, C2B, that protects the provider of software that filters or screens content that the provider or a person using it finds obscene, violent, harassing, and this is language from the statute, otherwise objectionable. So what was Congress's vision in enacting this provision, and why hasn't it yielded the kind of fruits that Congress might have been hoping for? What are the legal and practical barriers that still exist to middleware creation?
Well, you know that Section 230 C2B is my favorite section. So, this is 1996, right? The Congress is thinking about content coming from websites, being consumed through browsers, and what they have in mind is things like Net Nanny or Safe Surf, for those who are old enough to remember those things. Something that would be, for example, a browser extension to block particular content from showing up, mostly so that parents could protect kids from porn. And that kind of thing existed. They were very clumsy. They would overblock, they would underblock. But I think, to your question of why didn't this create a giant ecosystem of providers of those kinds of tools, and tools that might do things besides porn, that might intervene in violence or intervene in sexism, whatever. I think one answer is nobody foresaw, or I don't know, Congress didn't foresee the incredible consolidation of content not on a bunch of individual websites, but instead on centrally controlled social media platforms. And those social media platforms brought in a function that people wanted, which is content moderation, so you're not confronted with spam and porn and pro-anorexia content and just all kinds of garbage all the time. Even if people aren't happy with the specific rules they're enforcing or how good a job they do, platforms did kind of step into that function. And so there wasn't as much need or demand for those end user controls. But the more dissatisfaction we have with our current incumbents, and I'm sensing a lot of dissatisfaction, the more reason there is to want and embrace and support the kinds of tools that Congress was trying to enable. The shortcoming of C2B, aside from, I think that's where the typo is, name checks the wrong other section. It's a Scrivener's error, technically. A shortcoming is that 230 doesn't immunize any of the providers, including middleware providers, from a certain category of claims, including intellectual property claims, and now including claims under Sesta Fosta or Take It Down. And so, particularly for intellectual property claims, that leaves middleware providers potentially vulnerable.
Yeah, I think that covers most of it. One of the big things is to stop preventing middleware providers from doing things. Basically, there's sorry. Adversarial interoperability is one of the things that Cory Doctorow has been talking about that sort of gets to all of that, that a lot can be done just by reverse engineering and working outside the platforms. So that's an important thing to do. One of the things that I think is enabling legislation for delegation, I think, is critical. The Access Act was a good start. There's some other things that are going in that direction. New York has a bill, I think it's S7476, that gets even more specific in terms of delegating control of your information feed. There's a newer Utah Data Choice Act that I think is going in the same direction. Missouri has tried to do something in terms of regulation. I don't know whether that's got any legal strength. I'm not a lawyer, so that's, maybe Daphne wants to comment on that. But I think giving users the right to control their attention is important. And also, communities should be able to have more of a role in social media. You can think of it as we have a choice between the worldwide walled garden or the World Wide Web of communities. And you can think of it as a web of communities is what we really need to enable, because that's what we used to have in society before the platforms basically stole it away from us and have made it much harder for the communities to participate in online dialogue.
So what more do lawmakers need to do then to kickstart this thriving ecosystem of middleware? Daphne, you alluded to the Power Ventures case before. There's the CFAA. Many states have their own analogs to that law. There are IP issues. What legal infrastructure needs to exist before this ecosystem can take off?
So I think there are kind of three camps here. One camp says you need legislation on competition grounds to compel interoperation. And that's kind of the strongest medicine. Of course, that raises, if you talk to people who do communications law and deal with interoperation at the FCC, you get a lot of eye rolling saying, let me tell you about the complexity, let me tell you about the capture. So, that could be complicated. And at the other extreme is a camp that says the market's going to take care of it. Don't worry, sit back, the middleware is coming. And I have long been a skeptic of that, but kind of in the last few years, the middleware has come a little bit with the spread of Blue Sky and wider adoption of Mastodon and Threads interoperating with Mastodon. So there's we'll see. And then in the middle is the camp you alluded to, which is where I sit at the moment, which is saying, look, there are all these legal barriers stopping this from happening, or largely stopping it, and we could fix those. We could make our anti-hacking laws still protect against real hacking without being a weapon for incumbents to use against middleware providers. We could do the same with DMCA Section 1201. That is a law enacted to stop people from hacking through the encryption on DVDs. To the extent we still need that, which I question, but we could still have that and not have it be a weapon for incumbents against middleware providers. Usually in cases about this, which by the way have a huge overlap with cases about web scraping, the legal questions for interoperability and the legal questions for people who collect data from the web, for example, for reporting and transparency, are generally the exact same legal questions. And as you know, in these cases, there's a kitchen sink of claims filed. So the two I talked about are the biggest one, but there's trespass to chattels, there's breach of terms of service, there are a bunch of things, many of which could have legislative fixes.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. And I think I touched on some of the things we can do legislatively before. To me, the key is to ensuring an open level market. And maybe it's not just legislation, but a regulatory agency that oversees this to deal with the details of how it works. I was just at an event at NYU on interoperability in both social media and AI and other areas. And one of the interesting things that came out of that was there's a paper out of NYU that's looking at the question of security and privacy, which is often raised as an objection to middleware. And there are tricky issues there. And a couple points. One is this paper provides a framework for looking at different kinds of issues of security. And basically, in general, security is a problem that just adds costs to the developer. And so the technologists are always going to say it's a security problem to add interoperability. And it's true, but that's a security problem that can be solved by engineering for the most part. And the paper gives some structure on which situations make it more difficult to do that, where is it easy. And it sort of leads to the idea you almost need a regulatory capability that understands the context to know when you do push for very strong interoperability and when you can't because of privacy issues. Related to that, Daphne had raised the privacy issue a long time ago in some discussions of middleware. And what I had suggested is maybe the answer to that is a two-level middleware solution where there's a tightly controlled layer that protects data that's sensitive, like the multi-party communications and the behavioral side of who's interacting with who, and doesn't release that to the more informal middlewares that are composing your attention. And you could certify these data cooperatives, and there's a whole movement for data cooperatives that manage user data for you. And part of Blue Sky's architecture is that the user controls their data. So with this kind of interoperability, that you can build multiple layers, and some of them can be tightly controlled, but the ones that give users the control of their attention can be in this more loosely controlled layer. Stephen Wolfram's testimony to Congress when it was doing, I think it led to the Access Act, was looking at options that you can have this secure layer and you send the algorithm to the data so it's never exposed to the providers of the middleware attention services. So a lot of it's an engineering problem. There are a lot of legal details and details to make it work, but it's not insoluble.
I'd also just like to encourage those in the room that have any questions to start queuing up the mic, which is over there. And I'll also take some questions that have been submitted online. But before I do, just picking up on something you just said, Richard, you alluded to the sort of privacy concerns that middleware poses. And I'm wondering if you could both unpack for us just precisely what those concerns are, and recognizing that we don't yet have a national data privacy law. What kinds of privacy protections do you think need to be in place for users to yield the benefits of middleware without exposing their data to bad actors?
Go for it.
Yeah, one good example of the kind of thing you can do, and it ties to, as we're moving toward AI is going to make a lot of this easier because one of the common arguments against middleware is the platforms are already giving people features for controlling their data and their privacy, and most users don't do it. They just take the defaults. And the problem is, most users don't have the technical skill, they don't have the patience, they don't want to learn about it. But if you move toward a personal AI agent that has the skills to do this, then you can get these agents from various sources. There can be, cooperatives. There can be places like Consumer Reports. There can be all kinds of sources that you can decide which is the one you trust to help you manage your data, and then it can determine how your data is released to these different services, and what can be done with it, and what controls can be put on that so that they don't run wild once they have the data. So there's security technologies that can limit what can be done with data, that make it more anonymous. For certain purposes, you don't really need to trace it to a person, but you can build toward that. So I think in regulation, you need to sort of be looking forward to where you're not fighting the last war, you're sort of preparing for where we're going and enabling this technology to work for us instead of against us.
So yes, let's have federal privacy legislation, please. And I'm not enough of a privacy lawyer to detail exactly what should be in there, but let's assume for the sake of argument, and I hope this is also true now, platforms cannot share your behavioral data with third parties without your permission, and they can't share your privately shared post, my cousin's photo on Facebook example, without your permission. So starting there, you have a privacy problem that actually I wrote about. I have an article in the Journal of Democracy from maybe 6 years ago that is kind of a concise explanation of the privacy and other problems as I see them with middleware. So if people are interested, go look there. But that variety of privacy problem, the cousin's photo problem, could indeed, I think, be solved with AI. Like, I am not a big AI booster, but I think the realistic scenario of all of your incoming things on the feed, including privately shared things, being moderated without it going to some server where a potentially creepy third party is going to see it, like, AI makes that much more realistic than it used to be. And it brings down the costs of content moderation, which makes it economically more feasible for middleware providers to enter the system. So there's a very real privacy question there, but there's also maybe a solution. And then the other privacy problem has to do with the behavioral data. The incumbent has a huge advantage in ranking algorithms because of having an enormous amount of data about, people who liked this video also liked that video, so they know what to recommend. Do you hand over all of that data to every middleware provider who comes and signs up? That seems problematic, but Dick has described some possible solutions with, like, send the algorithm to the data. Here again, I hope, I'm not an engineer, but I think and hope that AI can help. So the privacy problems are real. Some of them will be irreducible, I think, but there are ways forward for a lot of them.
We have a question in the room.
This is great. I want to, since Daphne objected to my use of the word pathology, I want to defend or clarify the use of that word. So I didn't actually mean that particular categories of lawful but awful speech should be thought of as pathological. I agree with you that the First Amendment was meant to, let individuals decide for themselves within broad parameters, what speech to think of in that way. I was thinking about things like the concentration of power, the power that a relatively small number of private actors have over public discourse, or the path dependence of algorithmic recommendations. Or filter bubbles. So these are all closely related, but I think of those things as at least plausibly characterized as pathological, or at the very least, like, deep problems with our digital public sphere. So that was all more of a comment than a question, but I do have a question about one piece of it. And Daphne, you used this phrase in just kind of offhand, and so if you want to retreat from it, you should. But I want to press a little bit on this idea that people are just seeing what they want to see. The users see the content that they want to see. I think of it in this way, and you'll correct me if I'm thinking of it in the wrong way, but let's say I go to a hardware store and buy a screwdriver, right? I come home, and the next day I go back to the hardware store, and all I see on the shelves are screwdrivers, right? That, to me, seems like a pretty good analog to what goes on social media, where I, watch one video with Steve Bannon, and then suddenly my feed is full of, videos of Steve Bannon. And there is a sense in which I certainly had something to do with it, right? Because I'm the one who chose the content in the first place. But the platform also has something to do with it, because the platform's making assumptions about what I want to see next from what I saw last, right? So that seems to me to be something that we might characterize as a pathology of the platforms or of public discourse online. even if we have no sort of specific objection to the particular substantive category of speech.
So Jamil, I'd totally forgotten that you were the source of the word pathology today, so I was not trying to attribute anything to you. And you make a good point about like is what you're seeing really what you want? But I guess I'm responding mostly to this almost like reductive meme version of the criticism of algorithms, which is it's all engagement based. They only show you what will keep you staring and clicking. That's the entire problem with ranking algorithms, which isn't going to be true for almost any real world platform because they are big one because they intervene with all these other editorial interventions. So that kind of goes to your point. You're not quite seeing what you want because they're downranking hate speech or whatever the editorial interventions. But to the extent that that's the critique, that it's purely engagement based, then it is a criticism of giving users what their behavior indicates they want. And I think in this theory of like all they want is engagement, they're highly motivated to give you what will in fact keep you sticking around and clicking. And so I wouldn't assume some external intervention from the platform trying to give you particular content. Again, in this mythical world of nothing but engagement-based ranking.
Hi, Courtney Raj, Director of the Center for Journalism and Liberty. So a couple of questions. One is, the First Amendment is designed to prevent government from intervening, not from giving necessarily individuals speech rights. Like, it's slightly different. And, we talk a lot about corporate personhood and the rights of speech, of these platforms to have speech rights, and yet they're also hosting other people's speech. So it just feels like there's a fundamental tension there. And then, none of the middleware issue gets at the core problem of the business model. So even if you have all the middleware there, isn't the fundamental core problem that you have these powerful intermediaries that are monetizing, we now know very, dangerous business models, but also, they're in this intermediary space where they have these constitutional protections and they have a profit motive. It just seems like middleware is not going to solve the actual problems. Like, it might help a little bit with content moderation, but it feels like that is a discussion from last, a couple years ago, as opposed to the core problems that we're facing now, which is these platforms that have so much power over our information and communication systems. And remembering that most of these, the biggest ones, they're not just, algorithmically coordinating one platform, but multiple platforms, like how we find, receive information, now with AI, et cetera. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I think middleware is a response to exactly that concern, right? It is the response that is rooted in saying there is centralized power. We don't like how that centralized, consolidated power is being used. How can we intervene to prevent precisely the problem that you are describing? And as, with apologies to the middleware wonks who've heard this 1,000 times, the reason it's hard to just say, let's break up TikTok into 100 little TikToks and have them compete is because it's better to be on the platform that has all the things you want to find. Or more social graph-driven networks are even more illustrative of this. You want to be on the email service where you can reach everyone else who has an email address. You want to be on the social media where you can be in contact with all of your friends. And so the point of middleware is to give user control, reduce the centralized power, but not forfeit those network effects where you're able to reach everyone.
But wouldn't Moody have done that as well? Wouldn't regulating them as neutral intermediaries have achieved the same thing, where you don't have to break them up, but you have them governed like telecoms, for example, where they don't get to play that role, and you don't need to have many of them because they have a natural monopoly.
Well, that's not what the Texas or Florida laws did. They came in and interposed state legislators' preferences for speech and said, from now on, you can't take down anything that mentions a candidate.
But
stuff
so
like
taking
that.
away the government's attempt, like what about just regulating them as neutral intermediaries akin to telecoms or railroads or other?
Do you want them to be
carriers?
neutral? Do you want them to leave up all the lawful hate speech?
Well, but you can take things down even if you're a neutral intermediary as long as it's through clearly established rules of common carriage.
Well, I think that sort of gets to the fundamental point that I was raising in terms of attention versus expression. And moderation as removal, I think, is just the wrong solution. It's not what the problem is. You don't need to remove things. What's needed is a better way to manage what comes to people's attention. If you put out something, whether it's illegal or awful or whatever it is, if it falls in the forest but nobody hears it, it doesn't really matter.
Right.
So the question is, who hears it? And the way the algorithms work is that they're using engagement as part of the reason, but they're amplifying or favoring, upranking things that will get attention. If you break that up, a number of things happen. The virality changes because now there's multiple algorithms. You have multiple people, multiple sources deciding which things go where, and it's no longer the platforms that have control of this. And one of the main things that's motivating the growth of Blue Sky and the ecosystem that's opening Blue Sky up is one of the people talk now about billionaire proofing. We saw what happened when Musk took over X and it suddenly changed its character. We saw what happened with the election where suddenly all the platforms stopped moderating one way and shifted to moderating another. So you get these battles over, what's the right kind of things to promote and what isn't. But if you open it up to middleware, and the other thing about middleware is it provides for exit, which is the other big word that's come up. I mean, it's tied in with the enshittification model, and the solution is exit, that if you don't like the platform, how the platform's doing things, you can just go to some other service and do the same thing. And because these are protocol-based, you can take your data, you can take your social graph. The platforms don't own that.
But
Can I just
Yeah.
fill in some First Amendment blanks also? Because, we have had, to some extent, mediated speech in a lot of ways for a lot of years. We've had newspapers that decide what letters to the editor to run. We've had cable companies that decide what content to carry on their cable channel. And, we have a stack of Supreme Court cases about this, some of which say, yes, the government can come along and tell this private actor something about what they are supposed to carry. So in the case of newspapers, the Supreme Court said, nope, even if this newspaper seems to have a local monopoly, we can't force them to carry something that's against their editorial policy. In the case of cable companies, with a mandate to carry local broadcast content, the Supreme Court said, yep, the cable company has a First Amendment right, the same right recognized in Moody, but also sometimes Congress can override that if they have a strong enough interest and it's narrowly tailored, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not that the platforms have some absolute right that can ever be overridden. I think that would be silly and bad, and it's also not what the case law says.
So can I just ask one question about the because you're talking about middleware, but I'm interested in taking one step back, the regulatory environment that you need to make this work, because in your world, it's basically up to the platform to decide, hey, we're going to do interoperability and allow middleware. So does that continue to be just at the discretion of the platform, or are there public policy mandates that need to be implemented?
And I'll just say, I think that's going to be our last question, just in light of time.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that gets to the idea of like the Access Act and these other ways to provide this right of delegation, that whether the large platforms continue to exist, I mean, the market can allow that, but if the users have a right of delegation of the formation of their feed and other rights about how their data is used and things of that sort, then that breaks the power of the platform to just control for everyone how this works. So it gives, that sort of opens the door to middleware. And that to me is the key enabling legislation, is the right of delegation.
Okay, Okay, well, thank you, Daphne and Richard, for that rich conversation, and thanks to the audience for those great questions.
That was a great panel. Thank you all so much. We'll take a little bit of a break, and we'll come back in 5 or 10 minutes. Thanks so much. right, let's get started again. And I am delighted to welcome our keynote speakers, Olivier Sylvain and Ethan Zuckerman. As you know from Jamil's introduction this morning, we are very fortunate at the Institute to have Olivier as a senior policy research fellow with us. He's also a professor of law at Fordham University and a former senior advisor to the chair of the FTC. And I also co-signed Jamil's recommendation of your fantastic book, Olivier. Ethan is an associate professor of public policy, communication, and information at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and where he founded the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure, a research group that is studying and building alternatives to the existing commercial intranet. He's also
Tragically, initiative.
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 Okay.
If you call it an institute, I'm going to get my hand slapped
Okay,
by
I apologize.
the
It's
government
an
of
initiative.
Massachusetts.
It's an initiative. I am being censored in real time. No, I'm
Yeah.
kidding. So he's also a prolific author. I just have to say, these two are incredibly thoughtful experts. They have been steeped in this area for a long time, and they approach the issue, the questions of middleware differently. And so I thought I'd frame the perspectives a bit as we get started, and then we'll just go from there. So Olivier, you have argued that middleware runs the danger of distracting us from the core problems of social media, right? Surveillance, addiction, polarization, mis and disinformation. And you also talk about a concern that we shouldn't make users responsible for the problems that regulators should address. And Ethan, my understanding is that you tend to see the American regulatory system as being captured, and you view middleware as a solution that's usable now by some subset of users, both to protect themselves and to demonstrate how systems could be designed differently. So I'd love it if you could, Ethan, give your reaction to Olivier's overarching position.
Well, putting aside the gross unfairness that I get to speak before Olivier gets to put his position out there, let me try it in this context. I've been teaching for about 10 years now a graduate course called Fixing Social Media. I now have renamed it Fixing Platform Power because I want to make sure that we can include AI and search and so on and so forth in there. And we spend the first half of the class basically reading literature about what might be wrong with social media. And of course, part of what's fun about this in an academic context is that there is way more headline science than there is actual science, right? This is the Jonathan Haidt problem, where if you cherry pick your way through the literature, you can come up with this, fairly convincing case that social media is driving our children nuts and we should get everyone off screens. When you actually dig into the lit, there are very real problems. They are not universal. They're not across the board. When you look at the problems of social media, there's three big categories that seem to come out. One is harms to individuals. Are we getting addicted? Are we having problems with body image? What is harming us individually? Second category is what is harming us as citizens in a democracy. Mis and disinformation, polarization, are we losing our ability to work as a democratic populace? Third, and maybe the worst, is how is social media making it possible for us to harm each other? And I would have to say that AI seems to really be accelerating this with the ability of deepfakes, so on and so forth. So my question sort of becomes, what do we already have that can come into play as middleware and help us along these lines? We have seen middleware interventions since very, very early on to give us increased control over how we're encountering social media. Ad blocking is perhaps the single most popular, most universal form of middleware. Possibly even more universal than that is the blocking of the dreaded pop-up ad. Those of you who understand the reference get the joke. The rest of you, you can Google me. We have found ways to give people increased control over what they're seeing in social media through what my lab refers to as the loyal client. Basically, a client that overrides the platform's preferences with your preferences. You can come in and say, I don't want infinite scroll. I actually want to spend 5 minutes on this tool, and then it's going to shut it off, and I'm going to back away from it. So we know that middleware can help us with that. We know that middleware can start helping us on some of the democratic stuff. Tournesol is this wonderful experiment from a group of French researchers where rather than using YouTube's recommendations of what video comes next, you can choose to become part of different groups that recommend videos to each other. You can opt into an alternative recommendation system. And there's an interesting way in which, depending on who you select, this can either broaden your worldview or narrow your worldview. We see some limited ways in which middleware help us on the third category. Tracy Chow's original block party was designed to deal with the sorts of massive sexist harassment she felt on Twitter and her ability to take moments where speech was being weaponized against her and she was able to put it in action. The problem with middleware is that it is a partial, incomplete, imperfect solution that mostly works for a group of highly technical users. This doesn't mean we should step away from middleware. It actually means we should step into it and try to make it more accessible and more pervasive, and we should try to pair it with other strategies. But as far as proof of concept of what's actually out there and what works, it's about as good as we get as far as demonstrating what works.
So I'm going to start now, and I do want to thank, before I start, Nadine and Jamil for having me collaborate with them. And today, this is such a thrill to see all of you. I see a lot of friends in the room. It's nice to see you all. I'm especially thrilled to be sitting here with Ethan, who I've been learning a lot from for a long time, as someone who's not expert on the technology by any means, on public infrastructure, and on platform governance. I'm also, I have to say, I wish I could sit in your class now, and I very much like the retitling, because it gets me to what I want to emphasize, and I think where we have points of agreement, and that there is an underlying pathology, a structural problem that middleware does not answer. And I worry that it actually doubles down on the regulatory model that brings us to where we are now. And that is information asymmetries define the way in which the online information economy works. This is not peripheral to the problem, and everything that I'm going to say comes from there, from this point. And in some ways, it's also a response to a point that Daphne made in the first panel, which I found constructive and also provocative, and that is that that there are analogs in the online space for everything that there is in the physical space or in other spaces. I think the online space presents information asymmetries we have never seen before. I think that there are opportunities for abuse and manipulation that we do not see in hardware stores or elsewhere. I very much like the hardware store example, Jamil. So with that being the case, can it be true that users can take possession of their online experience? And my answer is, I don't think so. I'd like to believe it. Now, I know that there are savvy, you're one of them. Ethan, there are many people in this room who are savvy enough to adversarially and not come up with techniques of managing their online experiences. But as a matter of course, I don't think that's where we are. And so to focus on the user as a solution doubles down on the problem we have now. I very much like the example of ad blockers, however. And it suggests something about what is possible with regards to middleware. What's fascinating about this, though, is it is a kind of market for what I call a market for moderation, and that browsers and online platforms recognize that there are some things that consumers want to have control over. And if there's one thing that they've cared about, it is the delivery of ads. But this is why, again, I say that this is intervention that is wholly insufficient. If the ad model is driving the current political economy, and we can talk more about engagement. This came up in the prior panel as well, to what extent engagement matters. This is what consumers are grasping for. And meanwhile, there are regulatory interventions that can attend to this. I've written about data protection. Many people think about data protection and privacy. This goes to the heart of the business model, and it's not just limits on targeted advertising. It would also be potentially minimization rules and purpose limitations, the kinds of things we see in the EU and California, and reforms to Section 230, which I suspect we'll talk maybe a little bit about.
Great. I can't believe we only have this portion of time because we could talk about this literally all day. So, Olivia, I'd like to come back to your point where you talked about looking at the user as a solution, and the challenge with doing so right now. Do you see a world in which we could get there? And maybe we want to reframe it not as user as solution, but user choice as a solution, so that we are actually building an ecosystem in which users do have a little bit more control. Do you see a place where we can get there?
Yeah, I mean, I see. I think there are ways to get there, but I think I start with the view that there have to be some basic ground rules put in place, antitrust, data protection, before we can have a clear vision of what it looks like when a user is articulating their reveal preference. I don't think patterns online reveal that, and so I mean it came up earlier today, and hopefully we'll talk about Ethan's case that Ramya has worked on involving Section 230 CB2. One of the questions in that prior panel was why hasn't this tools feature, this aspect of Section 230, what is supposed to give people the ability to moderate and control, filter the objectionable content that they get, why hasn't it hasn't it prevailed? And the reason is because users are not inclined to do it. And now maybe it's because companies are, extremely protective of their infrastructures, and there are plenty of cases that suggest it. But I think that there is some ambivalence about that on the part of users, and I don't want to poo-poo the possibility that users do want to assert themselves. But I think that they do expect a service. Most consumers do. And the best we can do is bake in protections so that consumers get what they need when they go online.
Ethan, do you have a response to that?
So I'm really interested in this argument about putting too much pressure on the user. Because interestingly enough, it's also one of the arguments that the platforms use for why they don't want to give us more fine-grained controls, right? So every time you go to a Twitter or something like that, and I'll use a real-world example. I'm an alcoholic. I'm 9 years into sobriety, but I have a long data trail as someone who likes and collects whiskeys. And man, does Twitter like selling whiskey to me. And Facebook is actually pretty good about letting you go in and opt out of alcohol ads, and I have, because it's pretty re-traumatizing actually when someone comes and says, "Would you like some Bullet bourbon?" And the answer is yes, I would like some Bullet bourbon. But so far, Twitter under various administrations has said, no, that's too fine a level of control. Users won't use it, therefore we're not going to provide it to you. Well, no, actually, we might use it if it were available, if we knew about it, so on and so forth. We have no fair test of these things. Usually when platforms give us control over what's in our feed, it's buried 4 or 5 levels down in settings. And so they end up saying, well, only 1% of users end up using this. Of course they do. You have set up an interface to make it virtually impossible for people to use this. When you make things easy, ad blocking has been made fairly easy. You'll see 40 or 50% of people choosing to do that. When it comes down to turning off pop-ups, it's probably 80 or 90% of people to do that. What you really have are the platforms fighting in the other direction. The reason it has been so hard to continue the case that we've been making against Meta is that the same techniques that we need to give control over what users you're following or unfollowing, right? We're trying to re-implement this piece of code called unfollow everywhere. The same things you need to do are exactly the same things you need to do ad blocking. Facebook now has dedicated teams of engineers obfuscating the pages so that it's difficult to ad block. There's no way that users armed with middleware are going to win in this tilted playing field. You would absolutely have to come up with some rules of the road around interoperability to be able to work on this. And as much as I wish we could get there just with 230, I actually don't think we can. I think 230 gives us the right to build the tools that we want, but it doesn't force the platforms to play along in a way that we can get good compliance. The reason I favor middleware is that it is a way of showing that another world is possible, right? It's a way of saying, if I want to live on a Twitter where 1,000 people can't spontaneously decide to harass me, Block Party offers an alternative to it. If I want to live on a YouTube where I can turn off YouTube's platform recommendations and rely on a crowd or a group to do it, I can do it. And the hope is that we can demonstrate that even this sort of partial middleware solution where the platforms are not working to make it easy for us has utility. And then we can use it to try to get a regulatory strategy that might get us to the point where we can do more powerful work here. My hope is that that is something that is realistic, both on the side of the Daphne Kellers of the world trying to ensure that we're not trampling on the First Amendment in doing this, and also recognizing that, you know, maybe we don't have the best and brightest regulators out there at this particular moment in time. I'm not sure that I trust that Brendan Carr is thinking very carefully about the intricacies of, you know, how we do the policy around this. But I think if you can go out and essentially say, no, this is a choice and markets-based approach, we simply want to get to the point where these platforms that we all have fears and concerns about make it easier for a set of developers to allow users to have increased choice.
What I really love about the way Ethan thinks and talks about this is came up in the last paragraph of his thoughtful remark here, and that is a theory of change, which we've talked about before, that this is a way to open up a possibility for reform, using a language that resonate with Americans, talking about free markets and choice. And I'm hopeful that that's true. What I think it also does is foreclose consideration of also a longstanding American tradition of consumer protection. Some people might think of this as paternalism, but the reason the National Highway Safety Administration has to intervene with regards to seatbelts is because people are using cars, but somebody's got to step in their shoes. The reason the FDA intervenes to provide not just disclosures to consumers about nutritional content or dietary or nutritional content is because they can only stand in the shoes of consumers. And so I worry that this theory of change is a head fake, a distraction that doesn't drill down on what are also longstanding American phenomena. And I want to, speaking of the companies, there was a time when people looked to the technologists who are running these companies as solutions. You don't need to go very far and look at the mottos that all these companies use to describe themselves, and people believed it, right? YouTube's in particular, broadcast yourself, an opportunity for everyone to kind of be a speaker and journalist in the world, but also to be a true listener. YouTube is a defendant in these cases that have resulted in jury verdicts at the end this week, and they're a defendant that's lost substantially in spite of the story about user control. And so I think that, so to put this a little differently, I do think that there is a way that the Jonathan Haidts of the world have selectively drawn on concerns about children, but we have a jury now that has determined that that's the case based on evidence that they've seen. So I worry about endowing any company with the ability to make or adjudicate, what a user experience is. So the final point I make is, what are the controls against middleware operators and administrators, as well-meaning as they are now, for turning into the YouTubes of the future?
So I want to touch upon a couple of points that you both have made in terms of where to go with this. And one of my kind of overarching questions is, can't we do both? I mean, can't we have one of my favorite memes, that little girl saying, why not both? Like, why not both? Why can't we do something that allows for this extra layer, if you will, and incentivizes both new developers as well as the current major player platforms to say, this is actually where we're seeing this market go, and doing that alongside the type of regulatory framework that you're discussing, Olivier, where we might be able to see a future in which both are possible. So that's question one. And then question two, and this is maybe a smaller point, but I do want to raise it, which is that you talked about seat belts, and FDA and that kind of thing, which are all really good points. Does that map on perfectly, though, when we're talking about our digital public sphere, which has a different element and has that constitutionality element that we want to consider? So those are my...
Okay, can I start with the second one? And that is the romantic story that what is online is a public sphere that resembles anything that Putnam or Habermas or the early Western thinkers are talking about. I'm skeptical. I think it's a networked information economy that is defined by information asymmetry. So that's how I respond to that, and so that actually leads me to views about what the First Amendment means in this setting.
Right.
And I think there will be disagreement in this room, and I think disagreement with my friends at the First Amendment, the Knight First Amendment Institute, on the kinds of things that regulators should be thinking about regulating, because this is commercial. I see a lot of commercial speech, but I'm willing to say that there's a healthy disagreement on this point. With regards to whether we can do all of this together, I hope so, but I'm afraid of putting the cart before the horse. And in my mind, middleware or interoperability, broadly speaking, we may be getting ahead of ourselves. I'd love to see what the world looks like when consumers are protected from the kinds of informational harms that we've seen in these trials and elsewhere.
I guess my question is, I guess it's not a question. My skepticism comes from watching extremely weak tea put out by regulators. So I'm thinking about the California Consumer Privacy Act and its action on dark patterns, right? So there's not only explicit prohibitions against dark patterns in software engineering, there's an enforcement advisory around this, and I'm not sure that I've really seen, the ways in which content is being delivered change substantially around this. I think there are some very obvious, you're not allowed to use deceptive language, you can't, offer a double negative in signing up for canceling something. But we are still well within the realm of infinite scroll, we're still in the realm of manipulative feeds, so on and so forth. Either this has to do with regulators that are being run circles around by the engineers, or it's intentional. And I'm open to either view of it. But one way or another, it has not had the sorts of effects that we'd like. Even the Europeans are having this. Even the Europeans with GDPR have ended up with reintroducing the pop-up ad, except that this time it's to try to refuse cookies. Right. But it doesn't seem to have radically changed how we are being affected by these platforms. So in some ways, if what the regulators are offering is pretty damned weak, we need someone to offer an alternative. Yeah. And what I have been trying to offer is a scenario in which you have a client on your laptop and on your phone where your preferences override platform preferences. If you end up saying, I want to spend a maximum of 5 minutes on this platform, you spend a maximum of 5 minutes on this platform. If you say, I want fewer influencers and more of my actual friends, you get that. If you say, I want verified news, you get that. We know how to architect this. And the interesting thing is that the architecture has actually gotten a lot more attractive as LLMs get stronger. A lot of these questions that Daphne has rightly raised, where I'm taking content and I'm sending it out to a third-party scoring service, that is what we do on Gobo right now. We probably won't need to do that in another 3 to 6 months. In 3 to 6 months, a lot of the stuff that we can do could run on a small large language model running on the phone and could do the sort of textual analysis at that point. We still have questions about privacy or the backdoors and those things, but we can try to build something where we actually have full control on the device to give you that sort of loyal client that we're talking about. Is everyone going to use this loyal client? No. I would be thrilled if I got 1% of people to use this loyal client. And I would be much, much closer to being able to build this loyal client if I didn't have to spend all of my time on adversarial data collection, right? If I didn't have to treat every platform other than Mastodon and Blue Sky as an opponent, I would have a much better chance of doing it. So I'm looking for a little change. I'm looking for a little change in which platforms are forced to create a low or zero cost API where I could interoperate with them at that point. And then I just want to show you that a different world is possible. If I can show you that a different world is possible, a lot of other things sort of come out of that. At this point, the amount of work that I have to do to demonstrate that alternative model is incredibly challenging.
Sorry, go ahead. Please.
Well, one of the things I really like, Ethan, about your paper with Isaac Brickman is that you showcase. You have a proof of concept that are applied. You mentioned Block Party here, but that really do redound to the benefit of consumers. I am sold that you don't have to persuade me that it's possible. But these are, for me, specific projects that have very targeted intentions. And one of the points I've made, as you know, is that it'd be nice to move away from the tech solutionist intervention and think about its application in very specific circumstances. That would be closer to where I would like to see. But there are a couple of things you said that to which I also want to respond. One is just to repeat a point I made before, but ask it as a question. And that is, what is to stop the developer of a service for agentic AI or loyal clients? I don't know if this is the same thing or what. What is to stop, under current law, what stops them from going from Twitter to X? You know, because Twitter once was a place for healthy conversation. That was literally what they said, and have flipped the switch. So I'd love to know what the answer is to that. And I think the answer can't be middleware will solve this. I think that there are other regulatory interventions that have to matter. But I think even under your the strong point you made that others have made is a skepticism about regulation, about legislators. Right? We have the most ambitious state law as regards privacy in California, and you and I both know that there are really talented, smart people working at these agencies. And much of your point I take that is, have we seen a lot of change, right? Or even as to EU, have we seen a lot of change? And it doesn't appear that we have, right? We still, as you say, have the infinite scroll, although we'll see what happens in these coming years after this litigation. And what I worry about with regards to this argument is we don't have the best example of what is possible in government in office now. And I can be much more direct about this. This is a horror show, as far as I'm concerned. But That does not mean that regulatory intervention in any setting should be something we give up on. I think that there are opportunities, and this is why I have a theory of change that's important here, that this is not just about platform governance. This is about coalition building, advocating for policy change that is structural and deep, and that attends to every consumer and their needs at any given, at the time. Not just those who are capable of, negotiating, tweaks and levers in some middleware package.
I want to remind the audience that we will have questions, so please prepare your questions. And if you're online, please go ahead and send them, and we will capture those as well. Olivia, you actually asked a question I was going to ask, so you're way ahead of me, which is great. I was going to come back to your point about these developers. But I also, Ethan, you mentioned Tournesol, I think, this French entity or application, and I'm curious about. You talked about how people can choose to become part of different groups, right? And one of the things that we have talked about, that Olivier has talked about quite a bit, is this issue that we have that people are already siloed and already driven to various kind of we're very polarized, right? And people can go down these different rabbit holes. So it might seem all well and good if I say, for example, 15-year-old on Pinterest decides that rather than going down this other negative path, they want to go see things about puppies and cheerleaders, and okay, great, fine. I don't know where I got that from, but you see what I mean. But then what happens when the desire that they have is actually one that could be ultimately quite harmful to them, and how do we deal with that?
So this is the homophily trap, right? It gets called the echo chamber argument. Eli Pariser revives it as the filter bubble argument, where he blames it on the algorithms, but calling it the homophily trap is actually more helpful, because the reason it happens is that we tend to group with like-minded people. This is what my 2013 book, Rewire, is about, so it is something that I've thought about. If you want the full argument, you can find a copy of the book somewhere. The answer is, yeah, absolutely. People are going to use powerful tools to surround themselves with points of view that they care about. People already do this in incredibly analog forms. And generally speaking, under US law, we have agreed that this is okay. Stormfront.org still exists. You want to party with the neo-Nazis? You can go over to that website, and your ISP isn't going to block you, and you can read some of the most nasty, extreme stuff that you want.
Is that an advertisement for them?
That is not an advertisement for them. You know that most people have multiple facets to their identity. And most people don't just focus on one thing. This is referred to sometimes as the theory of interlocking publics. Because I have different groups of people that I interact with, because they have different sets of interests, I get different perspectives, I get different views of this. The very simple version of this is going on Facebook to hang out with my high school friends, who tend to be way to the right of where I am politically, and actually force me to encounter not only some content, but their reasons for believing in points of view that I find shocking or outrageous. So I think that there are ways in which we could use these tools to do a better job. That's the argument in Rewire. The argument in Rewire is, what if we actually consciously use these algorithms to try to give us a wider and more diverse view of the world? Even if these algorithms give us this capability of isolating ourselves in the filter bubble, that capability has existed for a very, very long time in an analog world. If you start moving into the notion of a loyal client, one of the things you can ask that loyal client to do for you is to monitor your media behavior and give you control of what comes from that, rather than giving it to a platform. A platform is monitoring your media behavior and trying to figure out how to serve you more of that stuff so that you spend more time on the platform, and how it makes you a more attractive advertising target. If I'm monitoring my own behavior and it says, Ethan, you haven't read anything by a Republican in the last 2 days, maybe you want to fix that. Or, by the way, the last time Sub-Saharan Africa showed up on your feed was 5 days ago. Maybe it's time to catch up with what's going on in Ghana and Nigeria. That actually could be very, very helpful. Again, I don't in any of this want to say that there shouldn't be a regulatory structure. I don't in any of this want to use this as a way of letting platforms off the hook. I am thrilled that you buy my vision of a better world. I don't think most people have heard or bought my vision of a better world, nor do I think that they are pushing for it. And so I think that idea of being able to say, wouldn't that be interesting if I could use these tools to monitor my behavior and make changes to it? I actually think that's a radically different view than most of us have right now of our interaction with social media or platform power.
So, I mean, there is a theory of civic virtue in what you described, and it is something that you've thought about and written about. I don't like to be the one that poo-poos it, because I aspire to it personally as well, that we can be better selves. I don't think people police themselves that way. You don't need to go very far to know that. How many people snooze on their alarms when it wakes them up, right? I mean, or sleep past it. I mean, that's maybe a flippant example. I just don't think that people orchestrate and organize for self-discipline in the way that you describe.
So you're an iPhone user, right?
I am, yeah. Of recent, but I am. I admit.
And have you turned off the screen time features, or do you get that weekly report?
I aspire to manage my. What I'm saying is, I don't know if that's an account that is universal.
I just find this super interesting, right? So Apple, as a platform, decided that they would give you a weekly nudge about your behavior. And that nudge is really interesting. It's basically a nudge that sort of says, hi, we make this highly desirable product and we would like to encourage you to use it less. And what I would say for the most part is I don't actually see people disabling that. Mm-hmm. For the most part, I see people, having an ambiguous relationship with it. Right. Am I happy with it? Do I know where I want to go with it? Right. I think for the most part, we simply haven't seen this happen. If we want to put a regulatory structure on this, I would love to see a regulatory structure in which social media platforms over a certain size are forced to report, this is how much time you spent on this platform this week, and here's what you spent it doing in general categories. I think that would be something that we could probably force without having strong First Amendment pushback, maybe. Yeah. But I think that actually would have a surprisingly significant effect in people essentially saying, I want more control over how I use this.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there are probably First Amendment problems with that. Even I think so. But I think the notion of civic virtue that is driving this is really attractive to me. And I would love to find a way to scale up this vision of self-discipline and self-regulation. And meanwhile, we do know what generally engenders good behavior, and that is law, regulation. And I don't know if it's disclosures about how often you use any given application. Maybe that's the way to go. I do think it presents speech problems. Why not talk about other kind of transparency interventions? Why not talk about other kinds of core regulatory, fixes? I'm not even talking about banning social media for people who are under 16. Talking about, things that are short of that.
If we have questions, please come up to the mics. We'd love to hear them, and online as well. This discussion has been so rich, and I'm truly grateful for it, and I think it's actually a really great lead into our next panel, because we will be discussing what policymakers should be thinking about. And so as people are getting ready to ask a question, I would love if you each could be to provide in your kind of perfect world, what what gets us to your perfect world? What do we have this system that is both focused on middleware and has a strong regulatory foundation? Like what is it you'd like to see?
As often happens when I'm in venues with Daphne Keller, she ends up saying the smartest thing that I'm going to walk away from an event with. And she had this observation this morning that rules on middleware and rules on scraping tend to be around exactly the same problems. I spend a lot of time on two related set of issues. I'm interested in these issues about user control, and I'm really interested in the ability to adversarially study platforms. And I do that by scraping them and taking stratified random samples of them and all sorts of fun statistics. I would love to see a path towards deep interoperability. This would be something in which platforms over a certain size need to reveal enough data that we can interoperate with them along the ways that I'm talking about, but also enough data so that we can independently do reporting on behaviors on those platforms, what sort of content is being shared, what's going back and forth, what the trends are on it, in such a way that we don't have to do it from an adversarial point of view, but it is a mandate associated with it. DSA 40 is a step in the right direction in the EU, but in trying to structure something very generous, they've put the onus in the wrong direction. By trying to sort of say, if you can demonstrate that this has to do with systemic risk, you can then request that data. I'd love to see an actual mandate of this data has to be available. And I think it turns out that the same data that lets you do deep interop for the sort of stuff that I'm doing goes a really long way towards the sort of transparency stuff. So that would be the policy framework that I would push.
I know so many people who care deeply about researcher access and interoperability that, and I know the Knight First Amendment Institute feels strongly about it. I share this interest, but as you would anticipate, that's not where I would start. And I think I want to return to one of Jamil's questions from the beginning to get to this. And what is the problem that to the extent that we trying to solve? I think the principal concern is the ways in which companies that dominate our networked information economy deliver content. I think that's what people are really worried about. And if that's true, many of you won't be surprised to hear that I think a solution lies in holding companies accountable for the decisions they make about how to deliver content. That means reforming one of the most extraordinary protections for big companies, and that is Section 230C. I don't think we need a repeal of 230C. I think I'm not averse to it, although I do see it presenting problems. I think, however, we should rethink, or courts, as we've been seeing, should rethink the scope of the protection. Congress can do this, but courts can also. Courts have been thinking about this and making distinctions between design decisions and content decisions. I think if we do that, in addition to data protection reform, I think if we do that, the companies are likelier. The salutary benefit, in any event, would be to attend to civic harms, public harms, not just awful content, right, or unlawful content, but generally content that doesn't come close to crossing the line. So for me, that would be a priority.
Great, thank you. Luke?
Thank you for all the comments today. I kind of want to take it back to something that I think Ethan brought up way earlier in the conversation around ease of use. And I'm just curious if we could drill down a little bit into what are the things that you think middleware or even more broadly, the considerations we need to see, or even what we've seen in terms of what are the tools that users actually use? Because one of the things that we've seen time and time again around these conversations is things are built for ideological reasons, and the true believers dedicate to them, but they're actually turn out to be very clunky and difficult to use. And so it's really hard to get, my mother, for example, to get involved in some of these situations. So I'm just curious if we could drill down a little bit in that.
So I resemble the remark of a developer building things out of ideology rather than out of usability. I would say, in my defense, one of the things that we've learned about usability is that usability comes from hundreds of thousands of points of contact with a user. And so Meta or anybody else who's got millions of users has this enormous advantage over open source software developers, which are that each one of those interactions is a point of data, and it's like a stone being rubbed on the beach. It gets smoother and smoother and smoother, and you get something usable and sort of beautiful out of it. Whereas if you create something new and it gets used by half a dozen crazy people for ideological reasons, they don't rub the edges off of it. When we first built Gobo, it had crazy levels of control, all these different settings, so on and so forth. Everyone said, this is wonderful, it's exactly what we want, and then we put it out there in the market and nobody used it. We now are about to publish a study on users' ability to audit how algorithms are working for them in filtering and ranking. My doctoral student, Spencer Lane, is defending his dissertation Monday on this work. And it works. We can demonstrate that users can figure out this algorithm's better than this other one. They can choose between it. I am willing to predict that we can put that in a product and it will absolutely not work. Now in 2026, I think what I would try to do for the naive user is basically say, hey, you can have your social media delivered whatever way you want. Write a few sentences telling me what your priorities are. So my priorities might be, I care more about local news than I care about national news. I don't really care about what influencers are saying. If you're going to give me national or international news, I want it sourced to a highly reliable thing. Oh, and by the way, I love an interspersing of photos of greyhounds because that's largely what makes me happy in life these days. And we're getting to the point where an LLM could probably write that into a set of rules that would actually work reasonably well. And so I think that may be the moment where this interface issue that is so hard and so difficult to work with obviates. But who knows? That only works if you get a lot of the same other environmental stuff that I'm trying to do at the same time.
I appreciate that the question wasn't addressed to me because you don't want me to build any service because I don't know how the company runs. One thing I'll say is when Mastodon was out on the scene, I really wanted to use Mastodon, right, based on the kind of distributed protocols that Dick was talking about before. And I was utterly confused. I think I have 5 different accounts across different servers, and I've no idea how to join them. I'm sure you can fix this.
I have terrible news for you, which is that Mastodon is considered a high watermark of usability in the open source space because it ripped off an interface that was developed extensively for Twitter and actually had hundreds of thousands of users, ripped it off full hand to make a more usable open source software product. That is the example of us doing open source well, my friend.
Okay, all right.
And that's how low the bar is.
Okay.
Color me concerned. Okay, please go.
Blue Sky is also open source, so maybe there's some hope. I'm Alyssa Cooper from the Knight Georgetown Institute, and actually, you sort of addressed part of my question, but I'll come back to it. I did just want to point out, when we were talking about the screen time tools on your iPhone, I was just thinking about this in the earlier panel as well, just to, I think it's always useful to contextualize that, even within a single company, making things more usable or putting them more prominently in front of users is feasible, and we have demonstrated proof of that. So I always think about app tracking transparency when we were having these conversations, which was like a forced choice that every iOS user had to make to decide whether they wanted other apps to be able to track them or not. And you see the take-up rates of that as they're at the opposite end of the spectrum of every other user control of most social media products, because every user was required, it was forced, right? So if you actually put it in front of people, then they do use the controls, but you talked about them being buried under 3 layers, and that's like the more common situation. My question though, and this I will disclose, I am one of those people who has gotten a little bit Claude Code pilled since December. So that's kind of the source of my question. But thinking about, when I think about your loyal agent paradigm, or your loyal client paradigm, it feels like it has a lot of, it's sort of rowing in the same direction as this trend of people being able to just use natural language to build things for themselves, which is something I've been doing quite a bit of. And I can sort of imagine that we're not that far off from either, oh, I can just ask Claude to build loyal Facebook for me or loyal Twitter for me, or somebody can do that and commercialize it. And so I'm just sort of curious about your outlook on that. I mean, obviously, if that had any level of success, then Facebook and Twitter would react accordingly. But also on the server side, to your adversarial setups, I'm curious whether the advent of the coding agents is helpful, or what the impact is in that regard, like whether you're able to build infrastructure that can monitor for when the platforms are changing things and react more quickly, or if it's helpful with the scraping side. I'm just curious like how the coding agents are changing the whole environment.
So I'm going to try to do this without getting too technical, because you and I have a danger of going into it, but we should also just talk one-on-one. One of the reasons I use the loyal client language is that it actually has a legacy well before the current moment. Email is built around a loyal client, right? All of those of us who learned to use email before the day of Gmail and sort of web-based interfaces, those were clients that could interact with a bunch of different email servers. You could set your preferences, and you could override what the server wanted to do. Going back into the days that demonstrate why my beard is gray, Usenet was a system of loyal clients and servers. You could decide how you wanted to deal with those text-based messages. You could even decide whether you wanted to get the spam or not. So you can go back to the 1970s and find, an argument for control over these things. You will very quickly fall into Olivier's objection, which is that this is for 1% of users, this is really hard to get around. Yes, the coding language potentially gets us there, that ability to sort of state your preferences. The code might also get us universal interop. So I'm working with a brilliant pair of students, one's at Harvard, one's at MIT. They are not ready to talk about their work on this project, so I'm going to be very vague about it. But talking about some of the things that you've talked about, you can imagine universal interop based on essentially saying, here is an obfuscated web page served to you by Facebook. Here is Claude Code on the fly figuring out how to decipher it. Here is a cached rule set, so the next person who downloads a Facebook page can use that cached set of rules. Here is a set of tests so that when those rules fail, Claude comes in again and creates another set of rules. So I think we can demonstrate, in theory, universal interoperability. It requires a lot of compute power. It's got some of Daphne's legitimate privacy concerns. And we have to burn down a stretch of the Amazon every time we use it to check our social media. Putting those small problems aside, it is theoretically possible, and maybe it gets us to the point where we can stop this stupid arms race between Meta trying to make it impossible for us to read their pages and actually give us the ability to try to customize how we see it. Though for that, there's a decent chance we're going to have to wait for Olivier to get the sort of mandates that he wants to get out of the regulators.
Alyssa, you're drawing a bit on Knight Georgetown Institute's
KGI.
KGI's research on safe algorithmic feeds, and I know you all talk about some of this in that report. I think the question is mostly addressed to Ethan, but I will say that everything you've described and what Ethan has just described just underscores for me that one of the basic ground rules that we need are not just data protection rules, but consumer protection rules. Because I'm not sure I still understand what the answer is to what happens when Claude decides to monetize, as OpenAI has said they plan on doing. Whatever if it's writing code or anything. And the reason I say that, the reason I've asked that question is because we don't have any laws in the at the federal level that protect against those kind of abuses. And this is not just about data protection. This is about dark patterns, and it is about consumer protection generally. So that's, you talked about ad blockers. I mean, these are all things that are at the margins where consumers are grasping for something to address the voracious way in which companies are processing information, collecting and monetizing information. That's why I think that's a thing we got to start with.
So we have just a couple minutes left, so I'll ask our maybe one more question. Great. Thank you.
Hi, Amy Weinkauf, also KGI. So this is a question, I think, that gets at this tension between choice and paternalism. It's interesting to think through middleware showing that a different reality or a different path is possible. But that path doesn't necessarily have to be a positive path, right? So like, I could set up middleware where I only get the inspiration. And how do we think about that trade-off as well?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer around that. And I'm not sure that there is a good answer around that, because you can also just find inspiration in the world that we're living in right now.
That's true, but clinicians themselves say that like the concentrated nature of that and like increasing pathways for it is, above and beyond the risk of the content in its distributed form now.
I would argue that the magazine rack of my childhood in the 1970s and 1980s went a whole long way on terrible body image for women and for men at the same time. Yes, it's more algorithmically powerful, but we are asking broad questions about what's possible within a public sphere. And here we can argue about whether it's a public sphere or not. I would like to give people increased control over what they're seeing and their choices to follow what they're seeing or not. I would love to be able to release a package that says, this is content that many people find worrisome, track how you're encountering it, decide where you want to go with it. I don't have a good way under the US First Amendment to go too far down lawful but awful, or even lawful but problematic, which is probably where we are on this. And also, at the end of the day, I'm at a disadvantage in that I'm not a lawyer, I'm an engineer on this. And my engineering solution on this is, boy, I'd really love for you to be able to monitor what you're getting and make choices around it. Because my sense is that sort of going in and saying, we're going to mandate that you do not carry is really difficult to sort of go about. My sense is even that we're going to mandate that you explicitly flag is really difficult to go about. What I'm hoping is that through intelligent application of ML, you can put something on this and sort of say, hey, here's a package that we recommend for young women under 20 who we know from studies are particularly vulnerable to this sort of content. Monitor, if you choose, how much of this that you end up encountering. That would be my proposed solution to that.
Yeah.
The problem you raise is something that everyone in this room who's written about this, right? I mean, I know Ethan and Renee, Daphne. I mean, they all recognize that there is this risk, and I love that you said you're at a disadvantage because you're not a lawyer. I feel I'm at disadvantage because I'm not an engineer, and maybe that's why we should keep talking. Maybe there is a technological way to address this problem. I don't know. I mean, evidently, this is not something we've solved.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Really fantastic. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Our
Amy.
last panel. Yeah.
My name is Ryan Morgan. I am a policy fellow here at the Knight First Amendment Institute. And this has been such an interesting and enriching conversation already. For our final panel, we are going to be talking about considerations for policymakers, which has obviously been touched on a lot already in the first two panels. And maybe we can get more in the weeds on this one. So with me is Renee DiResta, who is a social media researcher and the author of Invisible Rulers, The People Who Turn Lies into Reality. She studies adversarial abuse online, ranging from state actors running influence operations to spammers and scammers to issues related to child safety. In October 2024, she joined the Georgetown University McCourt School of Public Policy as an associate research professor. Prior to that, she was the technical research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory. And it does not say this in the bio on the website, but my notes say also Jim Jordan's favorite person.
Yes, thank you.
So that's exciting. Next to Renee, we have Luke Hogg, a senior fellow at the Foundation for American Innovation, where he focuses on the intersection of emerging technologies and public policy, with a particular focus on the ways in which public policy can induce a more open internet ecosystem and increase national security. He's also a visiting fellow at the National Security Institute at George Mason University. And Luke, my notes don't say what Jim Jordan thinks of you.
I'm probably the person that Jim Jordan likes the most on this panel, so that's not
Very good.
saying much, but
Very good. I wish we had put that in the official introduction. I'm glad you got a chance to say it yourself, though. It's better coming from you. And then finally, we have Anna Lenhart. Is an independent scholar, most recently served as a senior advisor at the U.S. Office of Science and Technology Policy, and a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland, where her research focuses on public engagement and social construction of expertise in tech policy, and the intersections of privacy, transparency, and competition. She previously served in the House of Representatives as a senior technology legislative aide to Representative Trahan, and as a congressional innovation fellow for the House Judiciary Digital Markets Investigation in the 116th Congress.
Jim Jordan's committee.
Jim Jordan's committee. I doubt that will be the last time we talk about Jim Jordan, but we could try. So to sort of frame this, I think one of the ways at the Institute that we've been thinking about policy issues as well as the legal issues is both in the short term and in the long term. So I'm hoping we'll have a conversation that is aware of the current political reality, but not entirely bound by it. Able to think about what is possible in a post-2029 future, but also to think about policymaking broadly. We have the possibility of executive action. We have the possibility of legislative action. State and local legislatures are doing interesting things on this, many of which have come up again in the previous two panels. But I think watching the first two panels, about halfway through, Jamil's framing question has come up about what problems are we trying to solve. And I think maybe we start there for this one. But given that we're focused on the considerations for policymakers, maybe we can go down the line just to frame it as what what problems do you see as fixable from a policy perspective, maybe more quickly or easily than some of the deeper structural problems? Renee?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've been looking at a lot lately is adoption. And for a platform like Blue Sky, which has come up quite a bit, we're seeing a little bit of stalling growth. We're seeing challenges with users actually migrating there. One of the issues is reconstituting feeds, moving content or profiles with them. The interoperability that would enable that would facilitate that would perhaps lead to more robust activity on the platforms where this is most likely to move from being an experimental ecosystem into being a thriving ecosystem, is sort of hampered by the combination of the technological and the policy at this point. So I think that question of making the ecosystem richer, there are policy mechanisms that would enable that to happen a little bit faster. I think interoperability is probably where I would look to that. The other thing that you're starting to see is in Europe, conversations about Eurosky as a result of data sovereignty and tech sovereignty, stack sovereignty that they're having over there. There too, I think the question has been really limited by questions around who's going to fund it, what are they going to do to actually make it happen. So the combination of what is actually going to create the momentum, what policy levers might help create that momentum, is one of the things that I've been spending a little bit of time looking at.
You know, I think that's one of the fundamentally important questions when we're talking about middleware is what is the goal here? And I think one of the things is we sometimes get lost in very, very large questions and try and present technical solutions as kind of panaceas to a lot of the issues that we're talking about. And to be clear, I do think that middleware and user choice in general have a lot of positive impacts on some of these big societal issues that we're facing in terms of polarization, big D democracy, small D democracy. I do think that they have positive impacts, but obviously this is not going to be a panacea that's going to solve all of the woes that America or the world is facing right now. And so when I'm thinking about these things, I really try and approach policy questions from a position of realpolitik, and I think in order to kind of see a lot of the benefits, those big societal benefits, you have to have kind of incremental solutionism, which is, I think I generally agree. Renee and I were joking that like this whole panel is just going to be like, I agree with what everyone's saying. But I do agree with Renee, and I think the interoperability side is really important. But I think one of the two smaller, more solvable problems that we're talking about is one, competition. The ways in which platforms have been able to prevent competition and coming at it from a more free market perspective, that the competition actually produces good things for consumers, and consumers can get better platforms and better services through competition, and the ways the walled gardens have prevented that sort of competition. But I think the other one is that I personally think that user choice is a value unto itself. Like having more choice as consumers is just an inherently good thing. And so even if you don't see a lot of the benefits for competition, or perhaps the benefits to small d democracy, take a very long time. Like just allowing people to have more choice in how they are interacting online in the same ways that you have a lot of choice in how you interact in the physical world, that is an inherent good, and I think that's a very solvable way to start thinking about some of this stuff.
Yeah. So by way of background, I spent 3 years in Congress. I was one of the key staffers on the big antitrust package in 2020, which included the House version of the Access Act. So I got to dive in really deep on that text. And then I've also been a staffer working on some safe harbors around the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And so I've been in a lot of these conversations, and I believe deeply and endorse those policies, like many people in this room. But 3 big issues came up over and over and over again. One was around standards, and I'll cross-reference to Ethan and Alyssa's conversation about like LLMs might be able to sort of do some things here, but without having standards, and we have ActivityPub, we have AT protocol, but when we were writing these bills, we didn't, and the standards bodies were not quite in a spot where they were ready to work on them. So you had this chicken and egg situation where you had legislatures wanting interoperability and portability, but there's no standard. So we can circle back to that. And then we had privacy, came up over and over again. Access, eventually in the House, sort of fizzled, and bipartisan privacy legislation took over in the 118th and 119th that included interoperability and portability language. And I do think that's where it belongs, is in a privacy law. So I think there are ways to kind of think about that. And then global. And that's one that hasn't come up in the previous panels. But social media data in particular is global data. You can have an American superstar who has followers from around the world and is traveling and competing in the Olympics in France, and they post from France, right? So this is global networked data. So you quickly run into these issues of, oh, there's GDPR on the Europeans, there's Canada's protection law on the Canadians. It's like, how do we separate all this out, and the need for international standards? But I do want to get back to kind of what problems does it solve? Because the more I worked on this legislation, the more I was like, oh, there are some things that can be solved here. And I'm actually less on the choice bucket because, well, one, I use Blue Sky and haven't customized it at all, and I talk to parents every day in the same boat. But I'm in the information generation argument. I see these APIs as information generation, and I will echo the conversation around we need an expert agency, and we need it tomorrow, but maybe we get it in 2029. And what it can do is, and Olivier referenced the FDA, is it can open up information. The FDA opens up tons of information, not just in labeling drugs, but clinical trials database, reports written by the agency and the experts at the agency, reports that have to be written by the pharmaceuticals, incident databases, tons of different information meant to empower an ecosystem. So pharmaceutical drug companies use that information, insurance companies use that information, researchers use it, watchdogs use it. And so when I think about this work, I'm really passionate about the creation of APIs. Yes, for user choice, to the extent users do that, and the creation of developers who will use it to do creative things. But also this idea of like watchdogs being able to use it, of advertisers being able to use it, right? We have Fortune 500 companies in the United States that don't know what domains they fund sometimes because of the lack of transparency. And so I'll end on that, but that's the problems I think about a lot.
Well, then we should be able to wrap this all up by noon,
Yeah.
right? This seems pretty easy. But I did actually want to get to one of the things that you said, Anna. I'm interested also in hearing more about how it's working from the inside, because I think one of the sort of forever problems here is that the tech moves faster than regulators move, and the tech moves faster than Congress can understand. Mm-hmm. And so part of the struggle is to build something. I mean, you talked about working on the Access Act before LLMs were really a thing, but and when Nadine testified at Senate Commerce about Section 230 in our meetings with members and their staff ahead of time, they entirely wanted to talk about AI, right? So they're very responsive to the moment, and the incentives politically are very short term. So how do we think through? How did you work on this? How were you considering this when you worked on access, but also just more broadly, building something that is durable enough that whatever the next technology is, it will do the job, rather than what it looks to me now, which is that Congress and regulators are constantly playing catch up.
Yeah, 100%. And so I was there in the 117th Congress, which, as a reminder, was when Biden was in the White House and Democrats had the House and Senate. And we were working these big bipartisan packages, the antitrust package, the bipartisan privacy bill. That was the first to get through committee and break through gridlock. And then COSA came into play a little bit into that. So we had these big bipartisan bills, and we couldn't get them across the line. And I think couple things happened. So the first is the kind of more technical pieces that we've been talking about today, where you start to work on transparency or opening up APIs, you run straight into the lack of a privacy law. You start to work on a privacy law that doesn't allow data sharing between third parties, and you just, gave Google even more of a monopoly if you don't write that correctly, right? And so all of these things hit each other, and I have come to the intense conclusion that we have to have an expert agency that does all three, that does antitrust, strong antitrust that structurally separates, that does privacy, data minimization, data loyalty, ban on surveillance advertising, get to these core issues. And then that third piece is that information generation piece. So how do we do this given the political environment? We have to sell these sort of core structural things, which is really hard. And what I saw happen in the 117th was a couple problems. One, we didn't have the White House coming in with a clear vision. And that actually mattered, right? Because we had a clear vision around the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill, and that was communicated to senators, including senators that were blocking it, like Manchin. And we didn't have that for senators like Cantwell that were blocking the privacy bill, right? So that's the first thing. We have to have clear vision coming from clear leadership if we want the comprehensive full picture. And then we also didn't have people making phone calls. And that's where this gets really tricky. The First Amendment has come up today. We are here after some historic cases, which I would love for you all to talk about as well. The parents are mad. They're really mad. And they're grasping for these solutions that I think many of us in this room who care about the First Amendment are a little concerned about. So we have to understand they are the ones making phone calls. And we have to start to tie some of these solutions around choice and opening up information to those harms that they care about. And we have to do it over and over and over again to get those phone calls. So that's really what I saw, was lack of vision and lack of these phone calls coming in, and then just the way these are interconnected.
Yeah, Renee, Luke, any thoughts from you all on either the specific experience Anna's talking about or the broader tension between constantly catching up with constantly evolving tech versus the need to build longer-term policy solutions, if there is one?
I don't think we've seen very many policy solutions that have actually, come out and been applied, which is why you are seeing so much move through the courts right now.
Yeah.
This is where the frustration of parents is. I mean, I've got 3 kids. I don't let them use social media, and I fight with them about YouTube, but that's about it. No, and I think that sense of expecting, we've heard a few people say this, expecting users to constantly be the ones who are doing that policing, doing that maintenance, that constant maintenance, that constant trying to come up with solutions themselves has left a lot of people very frustrated. And so you are seeing the courts come through with decisions that may not be the best decision, but until and unless there is something that is put forward, this is where that energy is and is going to continue to be.
Yeah, happy to go on a deeper dive on kind of the court cases and where we are, but not a lawyer, so just following it from the policy perspective. I think one of the jokes that we have at FAI is it's the Telecommunications Act all the way down. Like when you talk about like long-term solutionism, one of the things that we keep bumping into is like, the last time we ever had these conversations out in the open and really did anything was 1996. And I mean, there were some changes in 1998, right? But like everything is basically like post 9/11. And I mean, I don't have to tell you guys like how much the technology has changed since then. And so part of it is, I remember when we were talking about net neutrality back in the day, like one of the things that we said is like, well, we really just need to like revisit the Telecom Act and like add a Title IV, right? Like that's really the solution here, but that's politically not going to happen. And I think that kind of brings me to a place where I think I disagree with Anna. Is I'm very, very skeptical of this idea of an expert agency that is going to do this well. To me, Ofcom is a bad word. I think that there's room for a lot of these conversations, but whenever people bring up expert agencies, I like to point to 2 recent examples. We do a lot of work with the FCC. I think there's a lot of people that would disagree. I'm trying to be delicate and diplomatic here. A lot of people that would disagree with some of the choices in the wording that Chairman Carr has used. The FCC is an expert agency, right? Like, that's what you're talking about. NTIA and Ariel Roth, expert agency. To go on the other side of the spectrum, right, like Lena Khan's FTC, expert agency. So the idea that that we can establish some sort of technocratic entity that is going to like make the right decision all the time and be insulated from politics, I just think is kind of an unrealistic. Which is why I think, while I agree with Anna's kind of goals here, I would disagree with the mechanism, and this is why one of the things that we look at is soft law mechanisms and the ways that we can use kind of existing mechanisms. Again, one of our favorite agencies is the National Institute for Standards and Technology. Like, those guys are great, even though they're out in Maryland. So how can we do these things to incentivize platforms and create kind of soft law standards and bring people along? Because as all of the Knight Georgetown would say, as Knight Columbia would say, like, you really quickly run up into constitutional issues. You really quickly run up against existing law when you're having a lot of these conversations. And so while I agree with Anna that we do need a privacy law, I'm not sure that we need the privacy regulatory agency of the United States of America.
Yeah, let me give you a chance to respond to that, Anna. I think it is the first thing that will come to mind for a lot of people, right? It's like, yeah, great, we need another Brendan Carr. Is that how are you thinking about that?
I think we absolutely have to think about this, and also with like the changes in Chevron and Humphreys and the court cases. This is the conversation we need to have, and I would argue we need to start now to prepare for a 2029. But I also think it does matter what authorities you're giving, right? And so this is why I'm really clear when I say strong antitrust enforcement, strong privacy enforcement. And on content issues, I lean heavily to strong looks like information generation. And that is probably it. Really good information generation that empowers and opens up APIs, creates reports, creates spaces where third parties can play around and make choices, paired with having it with the privacy regulator helps with some of those privacy trade-offs. But no, it is really important to think about the authorities we would give them and then have a bunch of checks on third parties being able to watch. I think the FDA is interesting, right? They have a complicated leader right now as well, but because insurance companies are watching and watchdogs are watching, it's playing out in an interesting way. So yeah, these are things you have to think about. But I actually have two questions for both of you, which is, how do you think about middleware as a solution to some of these problems that are so strong in the public right now, especially from like parents and things? I imagine both of you have thought about that.
I think it is recognizing that the existing platforms don't have very good controls. It provides an opportunity to use third-party tools that would perhaps create better controls, essentially, or better tools, better access. Third-party providers who have an opportunity to produce solutions specifically for tailored audiences. So the way that Tracy used Block Party to solve a problem that highly visible women on the internet have, you could also envision ways in which middleware providers would produce far better and more granular, easier to use tools for parents who want to create more secure environments for their children, particularly for parents who don't trust the platforms to do it themselves, or who have struggled with the tools that are inadequate, candidly. And so it would be an opportunity to create a market for other solutions that would sit in that space and fill that need.
Yeah, not a parent. Do care about kids. I mean, I agree with Renee. I think that we wrote a paper about age verification and kind of the kids' online safety issues that are facing us, and they're really, really thorny. And when I'm talking to kids' online safety advocates, parents, particularly people on the Christian right. If you kind of listen to them, what they're really asking for is exactly this. It's more choice, more ability to be able to control what their kids are seeing, what their kids are watching. I have anecdotes if you want to go down that rabbit hole, but I think that when I have tried to explain middleware to some of those people, a light bulb does come on. They're like, that's actually exactly what I want. They want. Say what you will about a lot of these kind of organizations, especially on the Christian right, but if they were able to build their own kind of content filter for YouTube that parents could download and operate, we might not even be having a lot of these conversations, right? If you're able to put the pick your filter here, right? I think in the paper, we listed out a bunch of examples. It was like the Fox News filter and the New York Times filter, the BBC filter. But if you kind of take that and you apply it to what I would say is like different parenting styles. And this is where I think, potentially LLMs can actually have a role to play. It's not only giving users, as in like an individual user, more control over their platform or over their online experience, it's also giving parents, theoretically, it could also be a way to give parents a lot more control over their children's online experience, which is fundamentally what they're asking for right now.
Yeah, and I've had a lot of conversations with parents too, and I've heard this exact same thing, but and you all have more of the more recent data, but doesn't Blue Sky data show that like most people are not actually using the ability?
I was actually just about to talk about that. So I've had a project, I've been doing interviews with feed creators and labelers. I have to actually write the paper now, get it out the door. It's been busy. But one of the things that's been interesting about it is, I would say two things. One, the labelers are almost always people who are motivated to help a community. That's why they're doing it, right? And so whether that's people who are in the furry community, actually there's a labeler who, where they don't like people who move into the zoophilia realm, right? They want to keep that out of their community. They don't like that at all. This is one example of one of the interviews that I had. There are a lot of very, very niche reasons why people create these labelers. And they do it largely because they're motivated by a sense of altruism and a sense that there are very niche rules for their community, and no centralized moderation is ever going to have that particular collection of rules. And they will also talk about wanting to bring on moderators who are specific to the community. So that's the other kind of piece of it, right? So when content is reported to the labeler evaluates it through the lens of somebody who is part of the community, where I might not be offended by it, but they very clearly are, and so that's where that sort of moderation decision comes from. And then it does not affect the broader experience of every other user on the platform, so that's how the labelers sort of see their work. The feed creators are doing it because they have an area of interest or expertise, and they see themselves as curators. And they sort of see themselves as providing an experience for people. It's actually quite easy to toggle. One of the things that has surprised me about Blue Sky is that they haven't prioritized emphasizing this at all. I do wonder now that there's been a bit of a leadership change if you will see the new CEO or the new leadership and product team come in and lean into that a little bit more. I think, I don't know if I came in on the red eye. I'm like trying to make sure I actually answered your question, or if I just went down a bunch of
my understanding is not that many people, and maybe it's just what you just said.
The usage piece. So one thing that's interesting is that they actually don't have very good visibility into how many users they have, because this has actually not even been instrumented. So this was sort of an interesting thing. So then there is like an entire other architecture of things like Graze.social, which are actually trying to build out infrastructure for analytics. And then also infrastructure for monetization. The other idea being that if you create opportunities for people to monetize, you will have more people who are doing it, and then more people who are promoting it, creating quality experiences, and then motivating the users to do it. So no, it is not as widely used a feature as you might expect, in part because it's just not really promoted, it's not really talked about. So you've got one or two feeds that people are aware of. But some of the bigger feeds do have millions of users, right? So it's not that it's nothing. It's just a question of, again, this chicken egg problem of build it and they will come versus how do you promote it.
Yeah, I would just, 3 quick points. One is I kind of feel like Blue Sky, I feel like we talk about Blue Sky a little bit too much in these conversations.
Because it exists. Yeah.
Because it exists, right? Like, it is the,
because we're all on
it's
it.
It's like we talk about Power.com, Blue Sky, Block Party, right? Because those are the 3 examples that we actually have. I think that important context here for Blue Sky is that, Jay Graber, the former CEO, who just recently stepped down, is on the record saying this, that like part of the problem of Blue Sky is that it got so popular so quick. So they had this great roadmap and how to bring people along and do a lot of this stuff. And then all of a sudden, overnight, after the exodus, they had like 35 million users, and like they've been spending most of their time just trying to make sure that the servers don't catch fire. So that's just a brief aside on Blue Sky. I think outside of the realm of Blue Sky, I think in terms of the kids online safety advocates and policymakers that I've heard have these conversations, you kind of have to bifurcate them into 2 groups. there are a lot of parents, and there's a lot of data that shows that there are a lot of parents that are out there trying to find new tools, trying to use new tools that are, I mean, all the way down to the ISP level. Like there's settings you can put on your router that people are using.
Yes.
I assume Renee uses those. And it's one of the interesting things is that the major platforms in the kind of knife fight battle on Capitol Hill over kids' online safety is they consistently come in and they're like, well, look at this laundry list of features that we have. Aren't we so great? And some of them are good. I think I should give credit where it's due. I think Instagram Teens has some problems, but like generally a good idea. But when you go talk to the parents, like the really, really actively engaged parents that really want to use a lot of these tools, they say two things. One, yeah, I can toggle that thing, but it doesn't really work very well. And two, it's really hard for me to like figure out how to toggle that thing because going back to the conversation, it's buried like 3 layers down in the settings. So in that realm, this is kind of why I asked the question I did earlier, is I think that usability needs to be a huge part of this conversation because, especially like I'm hearing that the younger generations don't even understand like file structures on computers anymore. Like anyway, I'll stop that rant. But the second group that I want to kind of bifurcate off to the side is there's another piece of the kids online safety conversation where people are primarily again, I don't want to cast aspersions. They are very concerned with society writ large and establishing rules of the road for children writ large. They're less concerned with how their personal child or children are interacting online. That is an entirely separate kind of conversation that gets into like social politics.
I do want to encourage people to start lining up for Q&A if you have questions, or just long statements you would have made if you were on the panel. That's also fine. But we are reaching that time. But let me ask about this, because I think when we're talking about identifying what problems need to be fixed, one of the problems people often identify is atomization and polarization and siloization, that we're all living in an echo chamber. And so maybe this will be the last blue sky mention, Luke, but like just speaking for myself, I 100% deleted Twitter and joined Blue Sky in order to be in more of an echo chamber. I did that for that reason. And I don't think I'm the only one who did that for that reason. And this is often, it's also a constant criticism leveled at the middleware solution, is that it's only going to push people deeper into their own rabbit holes. Do you agree maybe that siloization is a problem that needs fixing? And if you do you agree that middleware does not present a good solution to that problem?
So we have another project called Green Earth, which goes with Blue Sky, that is actually building bridging-based recommenders for Blue Sky, trying to use it as a way to bring together divergent publics, basically, that makes the argument that you can use, I think most people in here probably know what bridging-based recommenders do, but the idea that you're surfacing types of content, creating recommendations of feeds around offering polarizing topics, but by surfacing links or commentary that are not disagreeable, right? So even within Blue Sky, there are factions, that's the term that I like to use, but you can think about the AI debate on there, right? Maybe there are ways to have that in a healthier fashion or ways to have it in a less polarizing fashion. So building that as actually a feed, as middleware, essentially, that is in fact what we are doing. And we're doing it on Blue Sky because we can, because it's an open architecture and we can do it. We have another platform that we're in conversations with about working with them too, that has a much less left-wing audience base, because we do want to have that that information that comes just from seeing, it's a research project, what different communities do when they're, when they experience content in this way. I think that when you have, yes, you can see a universe in which that does happen. People will be able to self-select into whatever silo they want. I've never thought of it as being a fix for for misinformation or disinformation, because people can go and put themselves into their comfortable spots. But it also, at the same time, offers you an opportunity to create feeds and experiences that hopefully discourage that by reducing some of the other reasons why people want to do that on the internet, which is they're seeing disagreeable content, they're seeing harassing content, or they're seeing things framed in ways that put them on edge as opposed to making them feel that they can engage.
Yeah, I think all of these like tools that are being built are very interesting. I come back to like who will use them, and I'm also just reflecting on Olivier's comments from the last session on like core consumer protection and how do we think about interoperability and portability alongside that. And so there's a conversation happening in Europe around the Digital Services Act, where under the Digital Services Act, the very large online platforms have to assess their impacts on media freedom and pluralism. And you know, it's a conversation right now, how do you even assess that? And they're figuring out the metrics, and that's just gonna be a conversation. But then they also have to start brainstorming how to mitigate them. And that is where I do think about like investments in these types of bridging tools, but also like investments in local journalism and investments in school programs for digital literacy, so that in the digital literacy class they can learn why a bridging tool would be fun and helpful to use. And so I know it sounds sort of like weak to like point to those types of things, but when you're talking about mis and disinformation and echo chambers, it really does come down to we need to have good information out there, and we need to respect really good, well-done journalism and make that happen. And then we have to, from a young age, teach young people critical thinking and why they would want to seek out different views and good information, and then you can think about some of these technologies. So I'm thinking about that parallel too of, do we have interoperability and portability, and do we use some of these things around risk assessment? And I know in the US context under the First Amendment, we would have to be careful in terms of mandating mitigation, but I think we could still think about assessing risks and that type of mitigation.
Yeah, and I'll just be really quick here, because this is something that I really struggle with going back and forth. Honestly, I don't have a great answer for this, because fundamentally giving people more user choice I think ends up with more siloing, right? Like there is a lot of, there seems to me to be a disconnect between the literature and what we say people want online and how we kind of solve these big problems of polarization and siloing, and then the, people's actual actions, people's revealed preference is siloing. Like that's just the reality. And so, I don't have a great answer, but I think it's a combination of a lot of things. And I think middleware is something that can both help and hurt that, right? I love all the work on bridging that everyone's been doing. At the same time, it can exasperate it in other ways. And so I think, again, coming back to it, it's like middleware is not the panacea that's going to solve the problems of democracy. It's something it's a tool that we can use to make things better, and then we're gonna have to work together, right? Like to Anna's point, one of the things that I think I hadn't thought about until you just brought it up is like, some of this is about civic education and technology. And, interestingly enough, there's a lot of especially red states right now that are investing heavily in technology literacy programs, state of Florida, for example, state of Texas, in kind of early education, just trying to get people like understand like what's going on, because I didn't have that, y'all didn't have that. Hopefully that's beneficial, I don't know, we'll see.
We need to assess it.
Yeah, let's
monitor the situation.
With just a few minutes left, let's turn to Q&A. I will say the overall title of this event is Can Middleware Save Social Media? I think we've landed on the answer. The answer is kinda.
Maybe.
All right. Please.
Jeb Bell with Project Liberty Institute, one of the funders of the Green Earth Project that Renee mentioned. Just looking at the title of this panel, I was wondering if we could try to connect it back to the previous panel with Ethan and Olivier, in the sense of, for policymakers, I'm curious, because at Project Liberty Institute, we're really excited about agentic AI as like a disruptive moment that might actually present a better opportunity than fighting the behemoths of social media to give people choice. Is there a message that this panel feels is real and persuasive to tell policymakers the advent of agentic AI could change circumstances for actual regulation or incentives for a different kind of system? Or is this too hyped?
It's a huge question, and would love to talk in more detail. Like, one of the theories that we have at FAI is the Administrative Procedures Act was not built for an AI future, right? Like, there's a lot of procedural stuff that was not built for what is happening and is going to continue happening. I think the lesson or the message that I have for policymakers on agentic is there are problems in the system that these companies and these systems are going to, or these companies and these, I guess I'll just say systems, are going to run into that they don't even know that they have yet, right? There's a lot of questions about, I was talking to Daphne about some copyright stuff. There's a lot of questions about competition. These are all questions that we've been having for a very long time in very different contexts, and a lot of the solutions, at least in my mind, look very similar. So, I think the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act has been brought up, right? Like, that was written in the 80s because, long story short, Ronald Reagan watched the movie War Games, got freaked out, and then we passed this national security law. Maybe we should revisit that. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act is, Section 1201 is a big thing that we've been focused on, right? There's a lot of little low-hanging fruit that people that have worked in technology policy for a lot longer than I have been really just hammering on for 20, 30 years. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there that I think solves a lot of the problems that we are scared about right now. So look to that, and maybe let's do those things first, and then we kind of see how the rest plays out and deal with those problems later.
Yeah, I will echo some things and add some things. I've been also having these conversations with policymakers, and I think the first thing I try to kind of break down is when we're thinking about agentic AI, or LLMs even more broadly, it's helpful to remember that social media operates in a space where there is Section 230, right? There's this liability framework. And then agentic AI systems are often operating in a range of domains, many of which do have liability, do have laws. And so the first thing I kind of tell the policymakers is, if you're thinking about agentic AI being used in a bunch of these other sectors where there are laws, we need to deeply understand the laws that are there, how they could be applied right now, and where they can't. And the big issue that comes up a lot, and I'm not a lawyer, so apologies, is sort of who is responsible along the AI supply chain, right, from the developer to the deployer, and then the knowledge, right, the information asymmetries across that supply chain, and then how would you apply a knowledge standard across that supply chain if, someone had no way that they knew their agent was going to do X, Y, Z. So I think what agentic AI is doing is it is creating urgency for Congress to dive into things that have been needed, I would argue, have been needed for a long time. We've needed transparency across the AI stack for years, and now this might really get us what we would need. We've needed a privacy law that can clarify some of these things across, again, technological stacks, AI stacks, supply chains. We've needed competition law to really say, hey, you can't be a landlord that competes with your tenant. You don't get to own your data centers and be building systems that are competing with everyone else on the data centers that you own. So I would argue, I agree that, that we're not starting from scratch, and we should be looking at these conversations that have been happening for a long time, and let's use this as a moment of urgency to really get some power behind these things that we still don't have that we really need.
We are just about out of time, but let's take Olivier's question, and then we can call it. Only fair for you to get the last word.
Well, I want to, I'll be quick. One is an observation, I think, and I can't resist responding to Luke's observation about expert agencies. You may not be surprised to hear it, but the New Mexico case was brought by the Attorney General, the head of an agency, and I think it's probably, in my mind, we should be more cautious about the blanket attack on the role of agencies. They do a lot of things, including execute the laws and enforce law, not just promulgate rules. And we can have disagreements about that. But I want to ask about, I want to address this to Anna, and actually, it's something that you all were talking about, and maybe I want to pull out a little bit, and that is, what is the kind of language that regulators responded to with regards to, when you were talking about ADPA and the Access Act, with regards to data protection, that you think can bring families along, but doesn't use in traffic language of protecting kids. I have kids, and I also, with you, care about them. But I'm curious to know whether.
Yeah. No, it's so interesting. So both Access Act and ADPA didn't really have the kids groups in the coalition. And frankly, actually, that might have been one of their downfalls. But they were really focused on how do we be bipartisan laws and how do we use language around freedom and choice and, yeah, a lot of the things we've been using when we talk about middleware. Like that was a lot of the language we were using, which crosses the ideological spectrum. And I don't think we did a great job really explaining why this would matter to parents and why they should care. I remember this is going to go a little bit from Access Act to the App Store bill. And I remember parents being like, why do we care if Apple has an App Store monopoly? And I was like, oh, well, if they didn't, Common Sense Media could have their own App Store of all vetted apps. And you could give your kids an iPad that just has that set of vetted apps on it. But we just didn't have enough of those examples. And that's also why I asked Renee the same thing, because I think we need to have more of these examples to really show how these could be useful. And then we need to bring the parent groups into this coalition. Because right now they are in their own coalition around COSA and getting phones out of schools and getting rid of Section 230. And I think we would really benefit from trying to move them into these discussions. I don't know if I answered your question.
All right, well, thank you very much to Renee, to Luke, to Anna, to everybody for being here. This has been a very good conversation, and as I said, I think we answered the title question of the event, so nailed it, in my opinion. Thanks especially to everybody who flew in, and yeah, that's it for us.
Thank you.
Yes, of course.
And that's a wrap. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you very much to our panelists. We are really grateful to each of you for participating and for sharing your insights with us. If you are watching us online and or in the room and you are not following us on all of the channels, please do so, and also go to our website, knightcolumbia.org, and get our newsletter. Thanks so much.